Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Hey, Mike. Today's guest on the podcast is David Southwell. He recently completed the OSTAR race and came in first place. What's the OSTAR race? Well, we'll get into it in my conversation with, with David. And, you know, the interesting thing about this is he did this race during the month of May, or that's when the race happens. And the month of May is not the time of year that if I was going to come across the Atlantic Ocean, I'd want to do it. And part of the reason that it has to do with weather patterns, which, there's these books that have actually been around for a long, long time that talk about the world and what time of year is the right time of year to be going in. If you want to get from point A to point B, it'll tell you this is the time of year to do it, and this is the time of year not to do it. So the OSTAR race happens during a period of time that I wouldn't come across the Atlantic then. But anyway, I had a great conversation with David. We talked about all sorts of stuff, and I just thought it was a really good interview with him.
Yeah, Bela, this does sound fascinating. And I think listeners should pay special attention, not only to David's adventures and his stories, but if you're at all motivated to consider long distance racing, I think there'll be a lot of practical, helpful tips to consider this kind of longer distance racing, because it's a whole different thing than just going out for a day sail. So I think This will be a really good, useful primer for people.
And it's long distance solo racing.
Yep. It's a whole difference when it's you and a crew of 6 or 8 or whatever versus you by yourself.
Yeah. So let's jump right into my conversation with David. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on it.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So, hey, I'm really excited about chatting with you because you have completed and won something called the OSTAR race. Can you tell our listeners what that is?
Absolutely. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm English, and I'm of a certain age where the OSTAR race is the original single-handed transatlantic race, which was started in 1960 legendarily by a bet between Francis Chichester, who became, I think, the first person to sail around the world, and Blondie, who was a World War II veteran. And they bet each other £5 that they could race across the Atlantic the wrong way, nonstop, in May, and across the North Atlantic in May. So the first race was run in 1960, and it's run every 4 years since then, with the exception of COVID, when they had to delay it. And so I raced in the 2024 race, and the previous race had been done in 2022. But it's primarily been won by the French, because the French are really the world's greatest ocean racers. And there's only one other American that's ever won it, who was Phil Weld, who the brother of the former governor of Massachusetts, who won it in a trimaran called Moxy. And it was named Moxy because most of the French boats were sponsored by liquor companies like Dubonnet and Pernod and companies like that. And he didn't have a sponsor. So there was a soft drink called Moxy, which came from Cape Cod. And he decided to just name his boat Moxy as a result, and he won it. But so I've followed this race ever since I was a child, and I've followed all of these ocean races. I read Robin Knox-Johnston's book when he won the original Golden Globe race and was the first person to sail around the world nonstop, single-handed. And I followed the OSTAR, and I always wanted to do it. And I finally got to a point where I actually could. I trained in solo sailing by doing Bermuda One-Two races, where you sail from Newport, Rhode Island. You race from Newport, Rhode Island down to Bermuda alone, and then you turn around and you race back double-handed. So I trained for it with that.
Wow. So as I've been learning more and more about these various races, some of them have pretty strict design rules. The boats can be so long, so wide, etc. And other ones are sort of wide open. You can show up with anything you want, long as it's powered by wind. Where does the OSTAR sort of fit into that spectrum?
Well, the OSTAR is you have to be less than 60 feet. And they do allow multi-hulls, but you basically have to be less than 60 feet, and you have to have a certain what's called sticks rule, which is if you tip your boat upside down, it's a certain number of degrees at which the boat will turn itself back. And that was really started from the 1979 Fastnet race, where quite a number of boats turned upside down and stayed upside down. And also the 2011 Chicago Mackinac race, which I was actually in. And I was 2 miles away from a boat called Wingnuts, which was a Kiwi 35 that had kind of extensions on each side so that you could get the weight outwards. And the boat should never have been allowed into the race. And they had a 100-mile-an-hour microburst, and the boat tipped on its side. The wind caught one of the wings. It turned upside down. And it was later discovered that Kiwi 35s were more stable upside down than they were right way up. So they tightened the rules on it. But my boat is a J121. So it's a regular 40-foot J boat, really. And many of the other boats are, there was a Rustler 32, there was some Janos in it. And it's what's called a Category A race. So the round the world races are Category 0, which means they need to not let a drop of water in if they turn upside down. If you close the hatch and turn it upside down, they test it to make sure no water gets in. My boat isn't that watertight, but it's got to have all kinds of safety things on it. And it's basically the same rule as if you race in the Bermuda race, you can race across the Atlantic.
Yeah, got it. So if it has this rule that it has to right itself, does that basically eliminate catamarans?
No, they allow people haven't raced catamarans for a while, but they do allow catamarans. And of course, if you turn a catamaran upside down, you're not getting it right way up again. So the world sailing ocean racing rules sort of require sticks racing on monohulls, but I don't know what they do about catamarans, because of course, if you flip a catamaran, that's
Right.
it.
Right.
You're in your life raft. But yeah, so my boat qualified, and one of the real issues with people that race this is most of them are English, and so they race their boat over, and then they have to get it back again, and they have to get it back before the hurricane season starts, which is theoretically why they run it in May. I was the opposite. I keep my boat in Nantucket, so I shipped my boat over there and kept it there the winter before, and came down and practiced, and then sailed it back, raced it back.
Yeah. So what sort of qualifying do you have to do to enter a race like this?
Well, theoretically, you just have to sail 1,000 miles in the boat in the same condition as it's going to be racing in, nonstop and single-handed. And I had actually modified a couple of things on my boat for the race. So I had to re-qualify, and I sailed the boat down from Newport, Rhode Island, to actually from Portland, Maine, down to Baltimore, where it was shipped to England, and that counted as a qualifier. But before that, I'd done 3 what are called Bermuda One-Two races, where you race down solo and back double-handed. And in order to qualify for those, you have to sail, I think it's 500 miles solo. And the Newport Yacht Club in Newport has races, 24-hour races that enable you to qualify for that. So it's kind of a whole series of qualifiers, and there are plenty of people who drop out because solo sailing is not for everybody.
Yeah.
Plenty of people who drop out.
So on that thread there, what What sort of intrigues you or drives you to do this by yourself?
Well, I think it's a number of things. One is that, when you race with a crew, you're doing one thing to some extent. And if you're racing with a 6-person crew to Bermuda, you typically have 2 watches of 3, or 3 watches of 3. And so you're sort of moving around, but you never have to do everything all at once. So if something goes wrong, you've got plenty of people to kind of fix it. And it always intrigued me, the concept of kind of having to sort things out on my own. I was trained by a French guy who came third in the mini Transat back in prehistory. He's a fairly old guy. And he took me out and he said, the thing about solo ocean sailing is if something goes wrong, there's no one to blame other than yourself. It's all you. And if you do well, you get all the glory. But he said, usually things go wrong and you need to learn how to fix them. So in order to do this, I needed to learn how to deal with alternators, deal with batteries, deal with engines, deal with navigation on my own, deal with medical stuff. I'm pretty healthy, but I had a medical consultant that taught me how to put an IV in myself, which was kind of interesting. So the training, you kind of have to enjoy the training to get into this. I think in many ways it's rather like flying. That if you, I'm not a pilot, but most of the people that I know that are pilots absolutely love it. And they enjoy the training, they enjoy staying qualified. And solo sailing is much the same way. I started out sailing dinghies on the east coast of England, and then I did crude races in the US. And then I got into double-handed. And I thought, well, this is fun. I wonder if I can do solo. And then I got into solo, and solo sailing is addictive because once you do it and you realize that, firstly, you can actually operate the boat on your own. And secondly, you can stand yourself for an extended period of time. There's a very considerable psychological element in the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I had someone I know who's a therapist who said, well, Jean-Paul Sartre said, if you're lonely while you're alone, then you're in bad company. And I was quite interested in figuring out whether I was going to be in bad company when I was on my own. So I would say there are psychological components to solo sailing. There's just the challenge of doing it and being able to do it. And the people that get into it become somewhat addicted to it, and you rarely do one race, and things always go wrong. The first Bermuda One-Two, it was the middle of the night, blowing probably 25 to 30, and I was going across the continental shelf, which is about 200 miles south of Newport. And the continental shelf, of course, is the canyons, which is where there's a lot of fishing activity. And it was dense fog. And I was sailing along and I suddenly heard a bang and my rudder came out of its upper bearing because it had hit, I don't quite know what it hit, but it hit either a drift net or some kind of a pot that was attached to a buoy on the bottom or something like that. And so my rudder was just flapping around. And I had a spare rudder that I had really focused on getting that would fit into a cassette in the stern of the boat. But I'd neglected to learn how to get my original rudder, which is much bigger, out of the boat if something like this happened. So, and it was flapping around, and I was worried that it was going to hole the stern of the boat. And I wound up calling the Coast Guard, who had a ship, an 87-foot cutter that came and essentially rescued me. They came and they had a mechanic who said, pull out your toolkit. And I said, well, you must have tools on your Coast Guard cutter. And he said, we do, but I think I can do this with your tools. And he got the rudder out with my tools, which was rather embarrassing that I could have done this on my own and I needed the Coast Guard to help me. But so that race didn't finish. And then I had another race 4 years later where I was south of the Gulf Stream and my wind meter at the top of my mast came unplugged from the instruments. And it came unplugged, and I did a crash jibe, and the mainsail split from luff to leech, like completely across. And so that was, so I've wound up sailing for 2 days just with a jib and a spinnaker. And I made it to Bermuda, but I thought, how on earth am I ever going to get back? How am I ever going to start the race going back? And one of my competitors turned out to be the first woman to race around the world. She's the only woman who has raced around the world solo nonstop, Cole Brower. And she said, well, I'll just get my crew to bring your spare mainsail down from Portland, which I thought was very nice of her, considering I was racing back against her. And so I was able to race back. So you often have these mishaps, and it's like perhaps the pain of a fall. You forget about it after a little while, and you start doing it again. Every time one of these things happens, I say to my wife, this is it. I'm not going to do any more solo sailing. And then a year later, I've entered a race again.
But I always find these mishaps, as you call them, to be part of the thing, at least for me, that makes sailing intriguing, because you sort of have to figure out, okay, what am I going to do now? It's like, okay, it's not going as planned. And even a 4-hour cruise doesn't go as planned. So there's always something that you're going to have to react to and then figure out and try your new approach. And to me, that's the part that I really enjoy. I enjoy that sort of mental challenge of okay, how can I overcome this problem, or how can I overcome this challenge to keep going? Yeah.
Yeah, and it is the same if you're on a crude race. The challenge has to be overcome. And I would say if you're solo, it's a little like sailing with people who don't know how to sail. I mean, if your spinnaker goes behind the boat in the water, for example, and you're sailing with a bunch of non-sailors, you've got extra hands, but you need to figure out what to tell them to do. If you're on your own, of course, you don't have any extra hands. So you just kind of have to figure it out. So the good news is that the competence level of the crew. The bad news is that the competence level of the crew might not be what you might want. And the third is you can't blame them.
Right. Hence your Coast Guard story about the guy fixing your rudder.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if that happens again, I know how to get my rudder out of my boat. So
Yeah.
I think one of the keys to solo sailing is to not make the same mistake twice. And of course, the best way to be lucky is to be well prepared.
Yes. Yeah. Somebody once said, I heard a quote. It's amazing. It's amazing how lucky you are when you're well prepared.
That is exactly right. And with this, your boat has to be well prepared, and you have to be well prepared. And you also have to be in the right mental state for it. You have to think, when you set out, you have to think, I've got this. I know what I'm doing. Even if you discover a couple of days later that you don't. But as long as you start out in the right frame of mind, you're probably going to be okay.
So how many boats are typically in one of these OSTAR races?
Well, the races in mine, there were 5. It was very few, but in the late 70s and early 80s, they had to cut it off at 150. And what happened after that was they allowed different sizes, and famously Alain Collat in, I think, the late 60s did it in a 200-foot long 3-masted schooner, which I'm sure was very highly automated. Interestingly, he didn't win the race. He won it later in a much smaller boat, but back then a lot of people wanted to do it. And then the boats became higher and higher performance. And when they limited the length to 60 feet, a lot of the French sailors were really getting into these big reaching machines. And so they essentially took the race and started their own transatlantic races that went from typically from Brittany to the Caribbean. And there are lots of those now, the Transat Jacques Vabre, the Route du Rhum. There are a lot of races you can do that, start in France. And my French trainer said, who was from Brittany, said, David, you can go and race in the US all you want. And he said, maybe you'll do well. You'll win some, you'll lose some. If you take this boat and take it to France and try to do ocean racing in France, you're going to come last most of the time. But he said, with all due respect, people in Brittany have been doing this since they were kids.
Yeah. Interesting. So when you did the race, is it I was going to say a mass start? So everybody starts, there's a starting line like in a typical sailboat race?
Oh, yeah, there's a start out of Plymouth. And famously, the only rule, historically, the only rule was that you needed to leave Eddystone Lighthouse to starboard. So I took off. It was pouring with rain when I took off. And I had the fastest boat, which was also the fastest rated boat. So I really needed to stay in front of everybody else. And I took off. I had a wonderful easterly breeze that took me down past the Scilly Isles, down the English Channel past the Scilly Isles, which was a great point of sail for my boat. And it was just a lovely start. And then I got out into the Atlantic and I started running into, you start running into the lows that come cruising across the Atlantic at that time of year. And typically the lows only take 2 or 3 days to get from the US to England. So it's kind of like playing pinball with these things. And my router, who I wasn't allowed to speak to during the race, had said, you may get one of these lows where you can sail up into the low on a really nice port reach, through the middle of the low, and then down on a really nice starboard reach, and because the lows go counterclockwise. And partially due to lack of sleep, I encountered one of these lows and I was sort of at the bottom of it. And I thought, God, this is such a great idea. I'm gonna sail up. And I started sailing up into it, and I was going very fast for my boat. I was extremely happy. And, solo sailing is a very emotional business, and I was on an absolute high. And then I realized I didn't seem to be getting any closer to the center of the low. So I took a closer look at my navigation software and realized that the low was moving north. And so I wound up sailing for 12 hours into a 30 gusting 50 gale. There again, it was so loud. It was in the middle of the night. And it was so loud that I didn't hear that my jib had become partially unfurled. And so by the time I got out of it, my jib looked as though it had 2 cannonball holes right through it. And my mainsail had become somewhat delaminated at the battens. So I got through it, which was good. And I realized I needed to do some sail repair. And I'd had North Sails give me a sail repair lesson. So I headed the boat south to essentially so that I could get the mainsail off the mast and repair it without having to look out for the boat. So I had it on autopilot and I had it on a good point of sail, but it wasn't headed towards Newport. It took me about 6 hours to repair the sail and get it back up. And at that point, I turned my Starlink back on. The Starlink was off because it uses a lot of power. So I turned it back on and looked at my emails, and I had about 4 emails from the race organizers. And the first one was, "Are you okay? You're not headed towards Newport." They have a tracker on board, a yellow brick. And the second one was, "We are very concerned. We have notified the UK Coast Guard." And the third one was the good news. The UK, there is a Royal Navy ship that's about 200 miles away from you that can come and rescue you. And I'm reading all this, and at this point, my sail was back up. I was headed back towards Newport. So I got on my computer and said, look, I'm fine, guys. So there's a benefit to all of the technology, but there's also a downside to it, which is that you're constantly being tracked. And sometimes you can't communicate what's going on, but you're absolutely fine. So I got through that, and then about a week later, I got to Newfoundland, to the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland, and I sailed across the Grand Banks. And the Grand Banks is interesting because you have a very cold current called the Labrador Current that comes down from the Arctic, and it meets the remnants of the Gulf Stream, which is at that point the North Atlantic Drift, which is warm, that comes up from the east coast of the US. So that results in dense fog and high winds, and it used to result in icebergs. There is unfortunately no ice left. The good news is I didn't have to worry about icebergs. The bad news is there aren't any icebergs. So I got through that, and then you sail south. You basically follow Nova Scotia south because I'm on the Great Circle route. So it's rather like if you take a plane from Heathrow to New York or Boston, you're spending about a third of your time over Canada. You're not just sailing across the Atlantic. Right. And that's because the Great Circle route is quite different than the Mercator route that you would see on a flat map. Right. And then, you leave Nantucket. They have a few more rules now. You have to obey the traffic separation schemes, and you have to leave Nantucket to starboard. And then which I was a little, I wish they didn't have that, because I know the waters around Nantucket really well, and I could have snuck in around the sandbars and shortened my distance. And then you sail across across Georges Bank, which is the fishing area kind of east of Newport, and then into Newport. So it's fun.
So how many days did that trip take you?
So it took me 21 days. And I was and if I'd done it the right way, if I hadn't had this sail issue, I might have saved a day, if that. So, and 21 days is fast for this, but it's not the fastest. I think the record was 10 days, which was that sort of sometime in the 90s.
Yeah. And so how do you two-part question, fatigue. How do you sort of manage fatigue, and how do you prepare your body for a trip like this?
Well, there's a benefit of age in this, because as I've got older, I find that I wake up during the night. I also have the benefit of having 3 cats who tend to jump on me. And so I'm used to waking up during the night. And the key with fatigue is to sleep when you can. And it all depends on where you are. So if you're on the continental shelf, particularly in the US, if you're on the continental shelf and you go to sleep and there's a ship headed towards you, theoretically, it will take that ship, if it's going at 22 knots, about 25 to 30 minutes to hit you. So on the continental shelf, there's a lot of fishing activity, and most of the fishing boats don't have AIS. So I have an AIS alarm, but I really can't sleep for longer than about 20 minutes while I'm on the shelf. In Europe, most of the fishing boats do have AIS, but I wasn't taking any chances. So you just kind of nap and you wake up, and it seems as though it would be very difficult to do this, but it actually is a lot easier than it seems. And then when you get out of the continental shelf and there's really no more fishing in the deep ocean, you turn on the AIS alarm, which is extremely loud. And I slept, I think the longest I slept was for 2 hours. All solo sailors learn about sleep cycles, and sleep cycles last an hour and a half. And you either want to sleep for less than 20 minutes or you want to sleep for a full hour and a half. Otherwise, you wake up with all kinds of grogginess and you can't kind of operate the boat. But I did have one time in the middle of the Atlantic, I'm sleeping at something like 2 in the morning, and the AIS alarm went off. And I have my radar and AIS set up so that I can be lying in my bunk and I can see it. And I could see a cargo ship that was about 5 miles. Well, the AIS alarm is a 5-mile alarm. There was a cargo ship headed right at me. And so you can imagine that I got out of bed pretty quickly and got on the VHF and called him. And he said, it took him a while to respond, but then he said, "Oh, yes, I see you." I said, "Oh, I'm the sailboat. Are you going to go to port or starboard?" And he avoided me, and we were fine. But fatigue can be a real issue. It's particularly an issue, oddly, for people who wake up late. People are either early birds or they're either larks or they're owls. And various studies have been done which have shown that people that wake up really early in the morning tend to be more prone to being able to do something like this. And I'm a super early riser. I usually get up at 5 in the morning anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you do anything to train your body before the race for something like this?
Not really. I mean, on the Bermuda, theoretically I should. I mean, I think theoretically you should get yourself on a sort of cyclic sleeping thing before the races. But what inevitably happens is you start a race and the adrenaline's running. And then you may have stormy conditions at the beginning, so you literally can't sleep. But one of the things that is useful is if you can just lie down, and I have an eye patch that I put over my eyes and I set an alarm. If you're in a place where there's not where you're sailing, there aren't a lot of boats evident, and you don't really need to operate the boat, it's always a good idea to go and have a nap, because you never know when a storm's going to come or you're going to get a fleet of fishing boats and you really can't sleep. So I've never been in a situation where I was really super fatigued, with the exception of when I was driving my boat back under Coast Guard, with a Coast Guard escort after my rudder got ripped out. Because I was driving it on my own for about 36 hours and I'd been up for 24 hours before that. So I was at the point where I was hallucinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So I think earlier you mentioned that whenever you do one of these, you say you're not going to do another one, but then shortly thereafter you say, okay, I'm ready for another one. So what's on your horizon?
Well, I am in the biotechnology business, and so I tend to either work or sail. And right now I'm working, and I'm hoping that I will be sort of back in sailing mode within the next few years. My boat is actually on the market, and my plan is potentially to buy a Class 40 and to do a race called the Globe 40 race. So there are races like the Vendée Globe or the Global Solo Challenge or the new Golden Globe that go around the world nonstop solo. There's another one called the Globe 40, which is a double-handed race where you sail from Spain, I think it's to Cape Town is the first stop, and which is very geographically desirable. And then you stop there for a couple of weeks, and then you sail to Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean, and you stop there for a couple of weeks, and then you go to Sydney, and then you go to Valparaiso in Chile, and then you go down around the Horn and back to Spain. And that would take probably 9 months in total, but it's only about 4 or 5 months of sailing. So to me, that would be really fun, doing it with, but that's double-handed, it's not solo. More nearly next summer, I'm planning on doing a double-handed Newport Bermuda race, because it's the year where the Newport Bermuda race runs. And then there's a great race that has just been started by the New York Yacht Club that goes back, called the Bermuda Short-Handed Return. And I think what they realized is that most of the accidents on the Bermuda race happen on the return. because most people will take pretty good racing crews down there, and then they have their friends sail with them back, and it's exactly the same sail back as it is down. And too often problems happen on the way back. So they've started a race where you can either go single-handed or double-handed on the way back. And I did that single-handed 4 years ago. And I remember taking a taxi from Bermuda to the marina, and the taxi driver said, you know, you're sailing back to the US on your own. He said, can you really not find anyone to sail with you? And I said, well, you know, maybe I want to do this.
Oh, that's a good line. Very nice. Hey, so David, is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think shorthanded ocean sailing is something of a dying sport in the US. And I think kids often don't want to get out and sail because, you know, it's easier to be on your screens. And sailing is just a fabulous sport. It's a great way to just live independently. And I grew up on a little dinghy, sailing a little dinghy on the east coast of England. And oftentimes the current would push me out to the North Sea and I'd have to kind of figure it out. And I'm so glad that I was able to do that as a child. Double-handed and single-handed sailing is even less popular. Probably because of the dangers involved. But if you train and if you kind of focus on what could go wrong, it's actually pretty safe. I mean, in the last Bermuda race, 3 boats sank and they were all fully crewed. And in most of these solo races, well, on the global solo, which Cole did, I think about a quarter of the boats sank, but no one died. You know, it was when you're well trained, it's fun training and it's fun competing in these things, and you get a huge sense of accomplishment when you've done them, whether you come first or last.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great way to summarize and end the podcast. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Bela.
You betcha.
All right. Thanks so much. Talk soon.
Bela, great interview and an amazing story. I mean, David was compelling, well told, and lots of different material was covered. What were your main takeaways?
You know, I'm always amazed with individuals who really challenge themselves. And you say to yourself, well, these are, you know, a lot of these things are physical challenge. We talk about climbing top of Mount Everest, or, you know, running 100 miles in the desert, or sailing across the Atlantic by yourself. And if you dive into any of this stuff with the people who do it, they say, yes, it's physical, but it's also unbelievably mental. And managing your brain is sort of a big part of this. And, you know, I just always find that fascinating, and why people decide to challenge themselves like that. You know, going across we interviewed people on here who were in the mini Transat, which is coming across the Atlantic Ocean in a 21-foot boat. My first boat was 22 feet long, and it wasn't that big. To solo nonstop around the world races. We've had people on from there as well. So it just always amazes me that people, for whatever reason, and I'm sure psychologists study this stuff, but you know, what makes people do that? What makes people want to do that? And it's sort of the combination of both sort of this mental and physical relationship that you have to have with yourself to be able to complete something like this successfully.
Yeah. And again, this idea of limits and where are your limits, and learning about your limits is a fascinating kind of throughout history of the human race, right? Has always been something that's been out there. And these one-handed sailing races really seem to push people to their limits. I loved how David was framing spending large blocks of time alone, because I think people are generally social, and most people, especially a lot of sailors, do this for the community and do this for the relationships and the interactions. And then there's this whole other element when you're doing a a one-handed race that's really you and yourself in a confined space under difficult conditions for a long time. I think the longest amount of time I've ever spent alone is like 3 hours, awake, right? I mean, I'm constantly working with other people and with my with my wife and with my friends. And it's rare that I spend a lot of time alone. So maybe this is something I should do more of, it'd be good for me. But what's the longest time that you spent on your boat alone, and what did it feel like? Were you pushing your limits at all, or how did that go?
Well, it's interesting you asked me that question. So I think I have hermit-like tendencies at certain times. And on the boat, I've gone out for day sails by myself. So I don't know, 6, 7 hours maybe I'm out there by myself. But I should probably not admit this, but I never feel like I'm alone because I'm constantly talking with myself. I mean, constantly I'm having a conversation. So clearly my brain needs that activity and that engagement. And if there's no one else around to do it, I just do it with myself. But I do enjoy those moments of solitude, right? Well, I go fly fishing. I'm by myself standing in the middle of a stream and there's really no one to talk to other than myself. And so my brain in these situations never really shuts down. And the same thing with sailing, right? So at least when I sail myself, my brain is constantly engaged in sort of what I'm doing. So I think it has more to do with kind of brain engagement. And are you engaged in a conversation or discussion with somebody? So that's sort of the social piece of it. But if you're doing some activity solo, then is your brain engaged in some sort of, managing that activity or talking to yourself? For example, I am not good at just sitting around and doing nothing. That drives me nuts. So that I can't do. So I don't know. It's interesting. I should probably, go get a therapist.
No, but clearly sailing is not one of those things where you're doing nothing.
That's right.
You're always thinking a step ahead. Your ears are always listening for strange, right, noises. It's a constant awareness. Right?
Yeah. I mean, even when I've done, long passages, I've never done those solo. There's been at least one other person on the boat, but I'm sitting in the cockpit for 4 hours by myself. And I will tell you, when you're out in the ocean, there's a lot less to worry about than there is when you're sailing around Narragansett Bay. On Narragansett Bay, you're constantly managing the situation, but you're out in the ocean, 20 miles offshore. There isn't much to do, but you're still aware of what's going on, your surroundings and around you, and sort of managing. And when I'm in those situations, I force myself to do stuff. I force myself to look at the chart plotter and where are we? How further do we have to go? So I force my brain to stay engaged. I think that's part of how I stay awake too.
Oh, interesting. Last question for you on a slightly different topic. The organization of these races, I find fascinating. Like, especially when I compare them to other sports, right? Where it's very structured and there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of there's commissioners and there's boards of oversight and all these things, right? These races seem to have developed very organically, and I think it's fascinating. It's primarily self-governed, right? The sailors are governing themselves. That's different, right? I think, unlike many other sports these days, money isn't the primary driver of any of this. People aren't doing it to get rich. People aren't doing it, right, for a salary, right? They're doing it truly because they love doing it. And, unlike a lot of these, there's not a lot of rules, right? What's the glue that keeps these races functioning and going on a regular basis in a sporting and an enjoyable way?
Yeah, that's a great observation, Mike. I think it's just because people are interested in doing it. That's it, right? Because there's no prize money, and and there's sort of two categories of sailboat racing. There's sort of the professional world, which is big money, carbon fiber boats, paid crews. There's still not a lot of prize money, but there's sponsorships, all that kind of stuff. And then there's sort of the amateur aspect of sailing, which is, as most sports and activities and professions like to come up with their own vocabulary for describing things. It's called Corinthian, right? That's sort of the amateur aspect of sailboat racing. And that's much looser. It's much less organized. And it's just, people do it because they want to do it. And they do it because they want to be part of something, right? You can sail across the Atlantic Ocean by yourself. You don't have to do it as part of one of these races. You can sail from New England down to Bermuda by yourself. But if you do it as part of the Marion to Bermuda race, then you're part of this activity. And then that brings in the social piece, right? You have other individuals, like-minded individuals who are doing the same thing. So I think it's really neat the way that these things have evolved. And I'm trying to think as I'm talking here, are there other examples in other sports where there's sort of this Corinthian, like activity where it's just people just get together to do something, to play football? I mean, yeah, there's amateur football. There's, Wednesday night or Thursday night football leagues and bowling leagues and all these things. But yeah, it's also a way that an individual can participate in a sport without having to be a professional. In other words, think of it this way. And this is true even in America's Cup races, right? Which for a long time was the pinnacle of sailboat racing. If you were wealthy enough, you could sponsor a boat and you could be on the boat during the race, right? So you could say, hey, I was the captain. You may have not touched the wheel, but you, except maybe going in and out of the harbor, but you were on the boat. You can't do that in like a car racing, right? They're not gonna let Bela, no matter how much money I have, race in the Indianapolis 500, right? There's a whole bunch of those things you can't do unless you have the skill necessary to do it. But in sailboat racing, particularly when it's crewed, you can basically buy yourself a seat on the boat. And if you have enough money, you sponsor your boat, you sponsor your crew, whether they're paid or not, right? But all of a sudden, you're part of this big event. So I think that's sort of an interesting aspect of it as well.
Yeah, that makes sense that there's these two parts. And the first part that you talked about, right, for people to just get engaged and be part of the community, this goes back to something we've just talked about so many times, which is this uniqueness of the sailing community, right?
Yes.
And it's the same glue that lets people help each other or talk to each other or show each other their boats or loan people a spare part when they need it or help make a change on the boat when they need it, right? This glue sounds like, from what you said, is kind of the similar reason why these people will just band together and year after year organize these races on their own for free.
That's right.
Right? So that's kind of cool. I like it.
Time to wrap this one up, Mike. What do you think?
Sure. Listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found our conversation with David interesting and thought-provoking, just like we did. As always, feel free to contact us by email at sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
And finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please hit that like button on your favorite podcasting application. And you can also find the podcast on YouTube now. And if you know of someone that might make a good guest on the show, let us know. So that's it for today's episode. Hope to see you out there on the water soon. Mike, as we record this, I look out my window here in upstate New York. We have about a foot of snow on the ground and it's 15 degrees out. So I am yearning for the warm weather and time to get back on the boat. See y'all soon.
I get it. And over here in Münster, Germany, let me do the quick calculation in my mind. It's about 35 Fahrenheit, which is pretty cold here. And we actually, it's very rare, we have probably an inch of snow on the ground. It's been snowing on and off flurries the last few days. So we have a little bit of a coating of white here, which is not so common. So I agree with you. And the days are here starting to get a little bit longer now. We're past the 21st of December. So that helps because, you know, we're way farther north than you are in New York. So our days are super short. But yeah, looking forward to spring, Bela. Nice to see you, and we'll see everybody next time.